Today we are here with Professor James A. Matisoff, Professor Emeritus of the University of California at Berkeley and one of the key figures in Sino-Tibetan linguistics since the mid-20th century, and one of the key developers of the whole field of Sino-Tibetan linguistics, and also one of the founders of the International Conferences on Sino-Tibetan Languages and Linguistics. And we are now here at the 50th such conference, and so we're taking this opportunity, which also happens to be the 80th year of his birth, and so we are going to be asking him a number of questions about his life and his work and the development of the field generally. So, Professor Matisoff, could you please tell us about some of these things? Thank you.
Okay, well, where to begin? I was born in 1937 in Boston, Massachusetts, and grew up there in New England. My first real study in depth of a foreign language, which was Hebrew, I was made to go to Hebrew school after public school from about age 7, and did a 6-year course, I guess, in 5 years. The class was very interesting because most of the kids in the class hated it because it was after public school and it was just something I had to get through. But I kind of enjoyed it, even though I would play hooky sometimes. And what the class was, we would read the Bible, and of course in Biblical Hebrew, and then the whole class was conducted in modern Hebrew. So we would translate verse by verse into the modern language and then talk about it that way. And
that's pretty advanced.
Yeah. Well, I remember especially on blackboard on the side, you took a completely regular verb, the triliteral verb SGR, samach gimel resh, which means to close, and he put the root in one color, and then all the prefixes and suffixes in another color, and the vowel changes in still another color. So I was like, wow, isn't this great? This part is stable, and then you have this and that, and you change the vowels, and I think that gave me a certain flexibility in non-Indo-European language at quite an early age. So I'm glad that happened. I went to school there, and I went to Harvard and got my BA and MA. Started off in philosophy, but decided after a while I had no talent for it, so I switched to French literature and got my BA in that, and then stayed on another year and got my MA in French, at which point I went to Europe on a traveling fellowship and spent most of the time in Paris, had a good time there, made various other trips. And then came a time for a big decision in my life. I could have gone back to Harvard and finished a PhD in French, although I was beginning to lose interest in that as an academic field. I love the French language and literature, but I was frankly getting a little bored with it. But in France, I met this guy who had been to Japan and told me what an interesting place it was. And I made this decision not to go back home after my year abroad, but to try going to Japan to study Japanese. And in retrospect, that seems to have been one of the best decisions I ever made. So I took a slow boat to India on that old line, I don't know if it still exists, Messagerie Maritime, leaving from Marseille to Bombay, going down the Red Sea, where I had a great case of stomach problems, solved by paregoric, which is an opium derivative, but that made me feel better. Finally got to Japan, and I had no idea about the Japanese academic world, where I should apply. I had heard of the University of Tokyo, but it turned out that's a very hard place to get into, and I hadn't done the proper applications and everything. But then a friend of mine told me about this school in Tokyo called International Christian University, which had an intensive Japanese program for foreigners. And I went there and I waved my Harvard MA at them, sort of, and they let me enroll. Didn't even charge me. And so I spent that whole year, 10 months anyway, in this intensive Japanese class. It was well organized. We were given a set of sentences to memorize every day, paying attention to pitch, accent, and all that stuff. And we'd be graded every day on how well we did. And the grades would be posted on the wall. So it was very motivational. I had to learn a certain number of Sino-Japanese characters every day. which we did, and had a very good time. Then came another moment of decision. What should I do? Should I go back and continue for a PhD in French at Harvard, or do what? But someone had put a bee in my bonnet about linguistics. One of my French professors said he thought maybe that would be more to my taste than straight French literature. So I did that, went back to Harvard, enrolled in the linguistics department, which was something of a mistake because it then, as now, was not a very good linguistics department. The chair was a guy called Joshua Whatmo, who was an Englishman who, he was a smart guy. He had a theory called selective variation about the history of language, but he plunged right into laryngeals and details of Indo-European, and he advised me to take computational linguistics with a guy called Anthony Ettinger, which I did, and involved a lot of calculus. I got a 65 in the midterm and dropped the class. And decided, if this is linguistics, I don't really want it. But this year I also started studying Chinese with the eldest daughter of Zhao Yuanren, the great Chinese linguist. Her name is Bian Rulan, but everybody called her Iris. It's funny, Americans called her Rulan, but Chinese tend to call her Iris for some reason. That was a wonderful class, intensive Chinese. Enjoyed that a lot. And that was the year I met this woman here, then Susan Kimball. We met in a Japanese class. It was a literary Japanese class, the Bungo, the Wenyu. And that was fun too. And after a few weeks, we decided we were going to get married. It didn't waste time. And it was sort of a good decision. We've been married now for 56 years, or whatever it is. 55 or 56? 55. 56 in January. And also, that was the year I became acquainted with Noam Chomsky, because in those days it was possible to cross-register for Harvard students who could take courses at MIT. So I did. I took a grammar course from him, and it was quite a deal in those days. He was just achieving top prominence in the profession. He would come into the classroom every day with a retinue of students like ducklings following him into the class. And he was very careful to produce only grammatical utterances. So he never allowed his lectures to be recorded because he might have made a grammatical mistake here or there. Competence and performance. So, and he would, start writing on the board. He'd make a big capital L, and said, "This is the class of all languages." And he would do L sub 1, L sub 2, L sub 3, ... LN. So, wow. And this is the class of possible grammars. G sub 1, G sub 2, G sub 3, ... G sub N. That seemed so scientific. Everyone was just wowed. So I took that class, and I became sort of the generative young Turk when I went to Berkeley later, but I'm jumping ahead. Anyway, spent this year in the Harvard PhD program in linguistics, but by a fortunate coincidence, Susan, my future and then wife, had a brother, also called Jim, who was a linguistics student at Berkeley. And he told her what a good department it was. And when he heard that his sister's boyfriend was studying linguistics at Harvard, he said, "What are you doing that for? It's not a good department. Come to Berkeley." So that was another big decision. And we decided to do that. And so Susan had been given a little Volkswagen Bug for her graduation present. And so we piled into that with all our worldly possessions and drove across the country. It took 2 weeks or so, and got to Berkeley, and enrolled in the linguistics department. And that was a good decision. The second summer we were there, then a graduate student at University of Arizona wrote to Mary Haas, the chair of the department, saying he would like to work with a linguist on his native language, which was Jingpo, or Kachin it was called in those days. And Mary knew that I was interested in Asian languages, so she thought I might like working with him that summer. And so I said, sure. And Moran came up to Berkeley, and he spoiled me for life. That's what to expect from an informant. We called them informants in those days, because he was a linguistics major at Arizona, and very sophisticated about his language. And so we started working on Jingpo, and I had the idea of taking Zhai Yuanren's Mandarin Primer and translating it into Jingpo. I still have that somewhere in a notebook. And I began asking him things like, today I'm going to the market, yesterday I went to the market, tomorrow I will go to the market. And he didn't seem very happy with this. And I soon got the idea this is not the way the language worked, and that there was no past, present, future. It was a different kind of system. Kind of perfective or completive, and tentative or hypothetical, but it wasn't past, present, future. And so I was already getting skeptical about transposing Western grammatical categories to languages of this type. Well, things might have ended there, but another coincidence, one's life is determined by these coincidences, I'm convinced. One of the field method languages offered that year, in those days, every Berkeley graduate student had to take a course in field methods. So two were being offered that year. One was in Amharic, and one was in Burmese. The Amharic course was taught by Harvey Pitkin, this guy who later got me my job at Columbia. And I liked the first day because he said, I want to show you some interesting things. He asked the informant, how do you say Peter? I said, Petru. Oh, ejectives. So I was all set to take that class. But then I found out that the other field methods class was in Burmese. And I had just spent that summer working with Leroy Moran on Jingpo. So I thought, this is more to my liking. So I went to Harvey Pitkin and said, excuse me, I would like to switch to the other field methods class. He said, okay. And so we started Burmese with Wally Chafe, and a kind of very touchy informant. I've had a few of those over the years, who was very impatient at being asked for too many repetitions. And I remember one day we were working on voiceless nasals, and we had him repeat the same many times. And his nose started to run, and he got very embarrassed. I ran out of the classroom and came back. He got more and more impatient as the year went on, but we eventually learned quite a bit of Burmese from him. And I began to see, well, some of these words in Burmese look a lot like these words in Jingpo. I didn't have much of an idea of how to reconstruct in those days. I thought that every word that meant a certain thing in one language would have to be cognate to the word which meant the same thing in another language. I quickly got over that notion. So that following summer, there was a LSA Institute in Bloomington, Indiana. And many interesting courses were being offered. Bodman was giving a course in Old Chinese. Cornyn, who was then teaching at Yale, was giving a course in Burmese. William Cornyn.
And Lee.
Yeah, and Li Fangui was giving a course in comparative Thai. Puli Blankos was giving a class there. So it was a great feast to audit all these courses. The chair of the department in those days was Mary R. Haas, who had two specialties. One was American Indian linguistics, in which she was one of the leaders in the field. She was a student of Sapir. And the other field was Thai linguistics. Like other American linguists, she had been recruited during the war and after the war, World War II this is, to study exotic languages. And since the United States had never been a colonial power in Southeast Asia, except for the Philippines, we were lagging far behind the British, the Dutch, and the French, who were the colonial powers. And there was money available to send students to that part of the world to learn languages. And this was also around Sputnik time, when we were afraid that the Russians were outstripping us in technology, things like that. And so it was very easy to get, relatively easy, to get fellowships to go abroad and study one of these languages. So I didn't have much of an idea of what languages were available then. I knew about Thai and I knew about Japanese and Chinese, but I somehow wanted to study a lesser known language. But I didn't have much idea of what would be a good one to study. So on my Fulbright application, they asked what language you want to study. I wrote Miao, Yao, Lahu, and/or Wa. And that worked. And I got this Fulbright Hays grant to go to Burma, it was called in those days. But that was 1964, and that was the year when Burma underwent a spasm of xenophobia and kicked out all the foreigners in the country, even people who'd been there their whole lives as missionaries or whatever, or Indian cloth merchants. They were all kicked out. So I went to Miss Haas, who's the chair of the department, and said, "What shall I do? I have this grant to go to Burma, but I can't go to Burma." And she said, "Well, there's another country nearby called Thailand, and there they speak many of the same languages that they speak in Burma. Why don't you see if you can get the grant shifted to Thailand?" And so I did that, and that wasn't much of a problem. There we were. At this point, we had a 9-month-old baby named Nadia, and we took off, the three of us, for Asia. First via Japan, first to Tokyo and then to Bangkok, and went up country to the then very charming city, still a very nice city, called Chiang Mai, the biggest city in the north, the second biggest city in Thailand, and found a place to live, and started looking around for someone who could help me work on some language. And by fortunate coincidence again, this young fellow showed up. He was maybe early 20s. He was never sure of his age. He had two names. He had an English name, Paul, and another name, Jalo, which turned out to be Lahu. And Paul, or I guess I call him Jalo from now on, was a native-born Lahu, but both of his parents died when he was about 9 years old. This is in Burma, in Shan State. So he was raised in a Shan family and learned Burmese very well, and his English was quite good. He explained to him what I would like him to do, go with me to Lahu villages, and he was willing. And I started off by asking him individual words, how do you say this, how do you say that? And he knew most of them, but some words he didn't know, even rather common words like navel or fingernail, something like that. Because he spoke Lahu like a 9-year-old, basically. He hadn't used the language in a long, long time. But through various contacts, we heard about this village about 60 kilometers north of Chiang Mai called Hue Ta, at a Christian village. And we went up there together, Jalo and I, by bus first, to a place called Cheng Dao. And then, as far as the bus would take us on the main road, we had to get off the bus then and walk up the mountain to the village, which is about a 3-hour proposition. I had a heavy reel-to-reel tape recorder, which I had bought in those days. No computers, this is way before computers. So the two of us would trudge up the mountain, windy, rocky road, and quite impassable in the rainy season, but this wasn't the rainy season yet. So we went up to this village, and we met the headman and the pastor, professor was called Jabo, headman is Jabi. Well, now you can probably tell that Ja is a prefix to male names in Lahu, traditional male names. Jalo explained to them in his kind of limited Lahu what I was there for, and they said, we will help you. And so I whipped out a notebook and turned on the tape recorder and started asking individual words, and asked them to repeat each word 3 times. So we started off with body parts, and head, and hair, and nose, and so on. We got to the fingers, and so a strange thing happened. Asked for thumb, I got thumb. Then asked for index finger, and everybody burst out laughing when he said the word 3 times. Prukhelat, no, prukhelat, no, prukhelat, no. Turns out the literal meaning of index finger is dog shit finger. I asked, why? So it's just about the same shape and size as a dog turd. So that sort of broke the ice. We went through the rest of the body. Not the shady parts the first time. And that began a rhythm of work that we observed for like 12 months, whatever it was. We'd go to the village and record things. And of course they were very fascinated by a tape recorder to hear what they had just said played back to them. They thought it was great fun. And I explained to them I wanted conversations about various topics, like hunting and building a house and the institution of the village headman and all that. They got the idea and would actually rehearse little skits to me. They would give each other different parts to play. And with sound effects, like they would make noises like gunshots or bark like dogs to imitate hunting techniques. And they enjoyed it, and then we played it back. And sometimes I would turn the tape recorder on when they were still rehearsing to get even more free conversation, even freer conversation. So this worked. We would record stuff and then go back to Chiang Mai. Susan didn't want to go live in the village, clearly, with a 9-month-old baby. So we had this nice house in Chiang Mai and go make trips to the village every couple of weeks and stay for a few days, and then go back and transcribe what had been recorded, start to analyze it. And of course there were a lot of words which Jalal didn't know at first, but being a native speaker, he had perfect accent and perfect ear for the language. And after several trips, his Lahu just skyrocketed and began to talk just like any other Lahu of his age. And we did this for a long, long time. And soon I got so I could go to the village by myself if I wanted to, which I did a few times. And we went to other villages too, mostly Christian villages. And this went on for, I guess, 15 months actually. 15 months, until February of 66. May of 66. Okay. And then we had to go home, back to San Francisco. And Susan's brother, Jim, who was a linguistics student then, picked us up at the airport in his, he also had a VW Bug with a roof rack. There were 4 of us in the car, he and his wife and Susan and I. But he neglected to bring any string or bungee cords or anything, just stuck the suitcases on the roof rack, which was a little roof rack. And so we got onto the freeway. And after a few minutes, we heard this thump. Looked out the back window. The suitcase was flown off the top of the car onto the highway, spilling out all the tapes, all my tapes, which were unrolled on the highway. So there was a blanket or something, a quilt in the car. So I must stop traffic, and we gathered up everything, all the spools, put them in the blanket, and in much more dampened mood, we continued our journey. But fortunately, the people in the Berkeley Language Lab did a great job in saving the tapes, which were never very high quality anyway, but they're even less high quality after that. But at least they were basically saved. So it shows you should never count your chickens before you hatch. I got an offer from Columbia University to join the faculty there. This was due to the good offices of one of my teachers at Berkeley called Harvey Pitkin. He was an anthropological linguist who was then teaching at Columbia. And he talked me up to them, told the people there that we made pot roast out of water buffaloes and things like that. Made us sound exotic. The chair of the department then was a great guy who became a dear friend of ours called Robert Austerlitz, who was a polymath and polyglot. He spoke about 12 languages, including, well, he had Romanian, German, and Hungarian as native languages. His wife was Finnish, so he learned Finnish and so forth. He worked on Gilyak, which was a Siberian language that you try to compare to Ainu, but it's not clear what it's related to. Anyway, he was a great mentor and supporter in the Columbia Linguistics Department. So when I was there, I started translating a few of the texts I had collected. Not to them, only about 30 of them, since I was very busy teaching for the first time, a lot of time preparing classes. I should say that I finished my dissertation the first year I was teaching at Columbia. That was in '66. I sent it in then and got the degree.
Yeah, that dissertation, you had a complete draft of it when we left Thailand in 1966. Because I typed that, so I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
And then you must have been reworking it.
Yes, I was still sort of under the generative thumb then. And so I thought I had to, write generative type rules. So like when I was dealing with the relative clauses, I would do the two basic sentences, first the matrix sentence and then the relative clause, and then the transformations to go from one to the other. Again, after a short time, it seemed to me very tedious. And so I rewrote the whole dissertation.
If I remember at your retirement, you showed a notice about how Jim Matisoff will explain generative grammar to us when you were a grad student, right?
Right. Yeah, I had to explain syntactic structures to them.
So is that why Berkeley still is not too formal? Just kidding.
Yeah. So I'm glad I got out from under that burden. And that was the year at Columbia, 1968, when there were these student riots, students occupying buildings on campus. And students were inside the buildings, the police were outside, and the faculty formed sort of a sanitary cordon around the buildings to prevent the police from running in and beating up the students. That was sort of fun. I should mention that before this, when we were still at Berkeley, in 1964, that was the free speech movement at Berkeley, where the same sort of thing was happening. So we got it bi-coastally, first at Berkeley and then at Columbia. So this eventually blew over. So somehow the idea came, well, since there's so much interest in Sino-Tibetan now in Southeast Asian here at Columbia. By the way, Søren Eggerud just got a job at Columbia then. So we had kind of escape velocity, you could say. Why don't we have a meeting or a conference about these languages? And so Columbia wasn't quite ready to do it then, but there were a bunch of people at Yale who were, including a guy called Roy Andrew Miller, Hugh Stimson, Samuel Martin, a Japanese scholar, and a couple of others. And a couple of other schools nearby had people interested in Southeast Asian languages. Princeton had a Chinese program then. Mei Zulin was there, and Jerry Norman. And at Cornell, there was Nick Bodman. And so a group of 8 of us met at Yale for the first time. We called it First Meeting on Sino-Tibetan Reconstruction. And all the papers had to do with historical reconstruction. And it was, tiny, we would call it nowadays a workshop, I guess. And everybody had to read everybody's paper in advance, had to be submitted in advance. And it was a lot of fun. So just the second time Australis and I decided to do it at Columbia. So the second one was there. Third one was at Cornell with Bodman. And by this time, I'd gotten to know a guy called Leroy Moran, who was at Jingpo. Leroy, by then, had a position as a linguistics professor at the University of Indiana. But that ended badly because they abolished the department. You understand the situation. And he eventually went into computers. But for a while, he was a stalwart at the Sino-Tibetan conferences until the mid-70s or so.
Wasn't that when you met Benedict also?
Oh, yes. I should have mentioned that. When we were in Thailand, I knew slightly an anthropologist called Frank Labar, who I showed my first paper to. One of my first papers was called Lahu and Proto-Lolo-Burmese. That was in 69 or 68, whenever it was. And he knew this amateur linguist called Paul Benedict, who was living in upstate New York, a place called Briarcliff Manor, just a short distance from New York in Westchester County. And he thought he would send this paper to him because he knew Benedict was doing Southeast Asian linguistics. And he did. And Benedict responded immediately with a long, long letter, which I still have. I still have his whole correspondence. By the way, I now have both ends of the correspondence because I inherited Benedict's books and papers after he died, and there were all our letters, our correspondence, which I've now arranged chronologically. Someday I'd like to do something after I expurgate it. So we quickly hit it off and got into this custom of meeting every Wednesday in a place called the West End, or the West End Cafe on, what's that street? Not Morningside Drive. Broadway, yes, Broadway. Right opposite the campus. And that's the first time I ever had kale, by the way. That was one of the vegetables. And Benedict would take out a napkin, and he was just getting into Austro-Thai then, and scribble these illegible scrawls as 3-syllable roots, and deriving this from the first 2 syllables, and deriving that from the second 2 syllables. And I would listen and sort of nod. And he offered me, well, in his first letter to me, he said, Schaefer and I went over this ground years ago, long ago. But this is interesting. So, so we had a good time there every week. And Benedict invited me to his home in Pleasantville. Briarcliff Manor. And I went up there, and he showed me his study. And he opened a drawer and pulled out this yellowed manuscript and said, here, you might enjoy looking at this. So I did, and it was a manuscript of the Conspectus, which he had written in 1942, 43 or so. And I stuck it in the drawer because nobody else was interested in it. And I read through it and blew my mind. And that's when we really started our weekly meetings. So that was one downside of leaving New York for Berkeley, that I no longer was in this weekly contact with Benedict. But we continued our correspondence for decades afterwards. And he would come to all the yearly Sino-Tibetan conference. So I taught there for 3.5 years. When I got this phone call from Professor Wally Chafe, who was then chair of the linguistics department, inviting me to come to Berkeley as an acting associate professor. And in those days, you didn't have to do much job application or job talks or stuff like that. It was definitely the old boys network. And so things were getting very touchy at Columbia in those days. Bad relationships in the department. And I was very glad to accept this